Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. Democrats are regrouping after a disappointing election day in key battleground states like Virginia and Pennsylvania. Republicans won Virginia's gubernatorial race Tuesday for the first time in over a decade. And in Pennsylvania, which has a key 2022 Senate race, Republicans swept 3 elections for Supreme Court seats. The friction between moderates and progressives over President Biden's spending plan has only been exacerbated. The most pressing issue for the president and his party: can they overcome internal divisions and get something passed before lawmakers turn their focus to next year's re-election campaigns?
We cannot wait. We have to move forward. We have to get this done for the American people. We have to make sure that we invest in our infrastructure. We have to ensure we invest in our human infrastructure, as we like to say it.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is insisting that a vote is coming soon, some reports saying even by the end of this week. But as of this afternoon, she still doesn't have any timing updates.
We're going to pass both bills, but in order to do so, we have to have votes for both bills, and that's where we are.
Let's bring in Ed O'Keefe, Natalie Brand, and Dan Balz. Ed is CBS News senior White House and political correspondent. Natalie covers Congress and the White House for CBS News. And Dan is the Washington Post chief correspondent. Welcome to you all. Natalie, let me start with you. Speaker Pelosi told Democrats in a closed-door meeting she wants a vote on President Biden's economic plan Thursday and one on the infrastructure bill on Friday. So what do we know actually about the timing at this moment?
Well, Elaine, I think what's most telling is we still don't have an exact timeline of when these bills could come to the floor. So that would indicate at this hour there's still question in her mind of whether she has the votes. You heard her say Thursday morning that they need to wait to have the votes. We know the speaker does not bring legislation to the floor unless she's confident that it's going to pass. So that is telling at this hour where we are right now. We also know that some moderate Democrats have talked about the need to work out some remaining issues and sticking points. Some have expressed that they want to wait to see the Congressional Budget Office score of this bill. And we heard very recently from Texas Democrat Henry Cuellar, who said that at this point it doesn't look like there are enough votes to move forward. So that's where we are Thursday evening. I also want to point out, Elaine, that even when House Democrats can come to an agreement and this bill moves to the floor in the House, it's still a bit unclear what happens in the Senate, because we know that moderate Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia was expressing today that he remains in opposition to paid family leave in the reconciliation bill. So there are some discrepancies between what's in the House legislation and where the Senate ends up, Elaine.
Well, Ed, let me ask you. You asked at the White House briefing about budget analysis of the president's economic plan. Why at this stage are we talking about whether the White House's spending plan will help or hurt the economy?
I mean, that's a big sticking point. That's the word I'm looking for. For a lot of these House Democrats who haven't necessarily signed on to the Build Back Better plan, or who at this hour are literally holding it up. They're waiting for analyses either by government bean counters or these private groups like Moody's to give them a sense of how much it's going to cost, what it might mean for inflation, what it would mean for the deficit, and whether it's really going to help. This Moody's report that the White House has been circulating today suggests that it's all paid for. It would boost economic growth. It would, to some extent, address inflation concerns. They say in that report they're worried about the implementation of this law, and perhaps that's the biggest risk in passing it. But otherwise, it justifies all the talk and all the work that the White House and Democrats have been trying to do to get it passed and sort of spark a little more economic growth. But it is those details from groups like that, from the Congressional Budget Office, from others, that is holding up getting enough House Democrats on board with their 3-seat majority to ensure, or 3-vote majority, I should say, to move forward either tonight or tomorrow, if that indeed is still possible.
Well, let's talk about the election. Dan, you've written about the aftershocks of Tuesday's election. Does it seem that moderates or progressives are better positioned to drive the Democrats' agenda in the dwindling legislative calendar?
Well, I think anybody who wants to stand in the way of the legislative calendar can do that, whether it's the progressives or the moderates. We see different folks standing in the way at different times. Right now, in the House, it's the moderates. And obviously in the Senate, it's Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema who've done that. But we've seen in the past the progressives stood in the way and forced Speaker Pelosi to delay a vote on the bill. So because, as Ed said, the majorities are so narrow, anybody who wants to stand in the way has enormous power. And what's fascinating is, you know, the president went to see and spoke to the House Democrats just before he went to Europe and tried to get them. Tried to get them to go along, and the speaker implored them to vote, and they didn't vote. She's implored them to vote again. The White House is imploring them to vote again, and we're still kind of in this standoff. And so it's not clear who, other than the people who can stand in the way, have the ability to get this done.
Well, Ed, how should we understand the relative popularity of these elements within President Biden's spending plan, while at the same time a majority of Americans thinking that the country is heading in the wrong direction?
Well, the White House and Democrats would tell you that's why we got to pass those popular things, because it would help put the country back in the right direction, or at least get voters thinking that we're headed back in the right direction. It is notable that over the course of this ongoing debate over what to pass and what exactly will be in it and how much it'll cost, you have seen pretty strong popularity for a lot of the proposals in there. Some of the proposals that didn't make it in as well, whether that's paid parental leave, which is paid leave, which is now back in the plan, and giving Medicare some more flexibility in negotiating lower drug prices. That's, you know, appears to some extent to possibly be in there now. Obviously, the ambitious push to fight climate change, the universal pre-K expansion, the child tax credit that's going to be extended for at least one more year. Those are popular items that, you know, not only test well in polling, but Democrats believe will help spur economic growth, or at least make it easier for workers to get back to work or to start looking for work again. So that's essentially the president's point now in the wake of these elections, as Dan was saying, is, you know, pass these things, and it will demonstrate to the American public that we are able to take advantage of our majority and get things done for them, and try to spark economic growth once again.
Well, Natalie, we mentioned Senator Joe Manchin. He told CNN on Thursday morning about the challenges of bipartisanship in the current environment. Let's listen to some of that.
You want to know what's wrong with the place? I go to work in a hostile working environment every day. If you're a Democrat and a Republican's up for election, you're supposed to be against that person. If Donald Duck's running against that person, you're supposed to give money from your PAC to help the other person beat the person that you've been working with.
So how difficult is that division, making the gridlock?
Well, in that same interview, Senator Manchin noted that when you don't have the other side, the other party participating in the legislative process, then you're not going to get their votes. That's what he alluded to in talking about the larger reconciliation package, or process rather, which bypasses the need for bipartisan support. And so we've seen both parties play out this strategy when they are in power, whether we're talking about the current Democratic social spending bill or the GOP tax cut under the Trump administration. So I think in one part of this, he's talking about the polarization that stems from this type of political strategy and trying to get legislation passed, which again is common across both sides of the aisle if you look back to when certain parties are in power. But as we've also been talking about, all of this comes amid the backdrop of what is an intense election season. And we got a taste of that this past Tuesday. The stakes were raised after Tuesday night. And so we're only going to see this type of political fight intensify heading into a midterm election season when votes and policy positions here in Washington, D.C. are going to be scrutinized back at home.
Well, Dan, you also wrote recently that, quote, too much can be read into the results of these off-year elections. But given Tuesday's results, the president's disapproval numbers, and the historical trend lines, is there a scenario where Democrats should not be concerned?
No. I mean, I also wrote that it would be foolhardy on the part of the Democrats to ignore what happened on Tuesday. I mean, the results were worse than they had expected. The loss of the Virginia governorship, the loss of the lieutenant governorship, and the attorney general, the very, very close race, which no one had anticipated in the New Jersey gubernatorial race. There were signals across the board that Democrats have a problem. And it begins, obviously, with the standing of the president, who at this point is underwater in his approval rating. Partly, we don't know what the conditions will be like in a year. And I think that the Democrats hope that if they eventually do pass both of these bills, not only will they have something to talk about in a positive way in 2022, but that the voters will understand or feel as though something has been done on their behalf. There's no guarantee of that, frankly, and they still go into the midterm year fighting history. I mean, as we know, the party that won the White House generally loses the first midterm election after a new president is elected. So again, with the very narrow majorities that they have a very steep hill to climb. And I think what Tuesday reminded everybody is not only is that a steep hill, but it may be steeper than they had imagined going into Tuesday.
Well, Ed, Virginia Democratic Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger told the New York Times that President Biden should remember that, quote, nobody elected him to be FDR. They elected him to be normal and stop the chaos. How does her sentiment square with how the president is trying to govern?
It was an interesting comment because, you know, he certainly did campaign on restoring the soul of the nation and trying to restore, as she put it, some sanity to this town and normalcy to the process of governing. But we do know in the closing weeks of his campaign, and certainly during the transition, there was a lot of time and thought put into what can he do if he wins to sort of try to transform the country and the economy and the world as it came out of the pandemic. And he was doing a lot of research into how Roosevelt had to take on all the challenges that he faced. And he has cited President Roosevelt as an example of somebody that he sort of emulates, in addition to other presidents. So she has a point. And as a moderate who's going to face a heck of a re-election fight next year, you know, she is certainly much more one of those in the camp of sort of trying to tread lightly here or tread cautiously over what exactly to do, because, you know, as Dan was pointing out with history that is against Democrats, the other piece of history recently that they face is the year after, or the year that they approve a big ambitious piece of legislation, they then take it on the chin in the elections and lose their seats. That's what happened back in 2010 after passage of the Affordable Care Act. And so members of Congress, moderates, or people from swing districts like Spanberger know that, and that's why they get a little wary of what they're about to do here, if they're about to do it, and sort of say, look, as long as he was trying to restore things to the way they were and make sure the pandemic, you know, winds down and tries to run things in a competent way, that's fulfilling his mission. But I think here at the White House they would argue otherwise, and that certainly is reflected in the way that they've conducted the presidency so far. You have to remember, this debate, as it nears its potential conclusion, has consumed this White House. This, plus what happened in Afghanistan there in the late summer, is essentially all that really he has been focused on. These incredible gaps in his schedule during the week where nothing public is going on, and he's just holding meetings with aides, he's talking to lawmakers, he's trying to convince them to get on board and work through the details with them. We have not seen this in recent presidents. Somebody takes so much time behind the scenes to negotiate the details of this legislation and try to get his party on board with getting it done. He has said he is patient about it, confident it'll happen, but certainly there are members of his party after this week who wonder whether this strategy will have been worth it.
Finally, Dan, much has been made about the influence of former President Trump. A central tenet of his messaging at any of the several rallies he's held after losing the White House is that America's election system is broken and Joe Biden's presidency is illegitimate. How does that message play for his party going into the midterms, you think?
Well, it's a double-edged sword, frankly. I mean, on the one hand, it continues to energize the Trump loyalists within the party, and we know that they are a substantial portion of the Republican coalition. On the other hand, it makes other Republicans quite uneasy because they know that what he is peddling is in fact false information. His attacks on Biden are unprecedented for a former president, but we've rarely had a former president who lost after the first term, who's decided within weeks that he seems to want to run for another term in 2024. And so, like, as with so many things with Donald Trump, we're in rather uncharted waters. But in Virginia, Glenn Youngkin, the governor-elect, was able to kind of navigate through all of that pretty effectively. But I don't think that that's necessarily going to be as easy for some other, in other states and other races that Republicans are going to be running. So the Trump factor is important, and it plays in both directions.
Yeah, it was really fascinating to see how Glenn Youngkin handled that, because he said that Joe Biden won fair and square. At the same time, he had the endorsement of former President Trump, who, as we said on this program, inserted himself, especially in those final days and hours, into that campaign. All right, Ed O'Keefe, Natalie Brand, and Dan Balz, good to have you all. Thank you very much.